All right, sounds good. We good? We live? All right.
You're live.
All right, well, John introduced my name already, but first, it would be awesome if everyone gave John, everyone at SDI, the appreciation for letting us be here tonight, keeping the shop open for everybody. So first, that's on that Sportsman's back. So this seminar is it's going to be about walleye jigging in general. Specifically here in a couple weeks, we have what is for most people one of the most exciting times of year, and that is walleye jigging on the Detroit River, whether it's in the lakes or the St. Clair River, but mainly the Detroit River and the St. Clair River here locally. Now, show of hands, how many of you guys have jigged, whether it's the Detroit River or St. Clair River before? Okay, fair amount of you. So the first thing we need to understand is when we're jigging for these walleyes in the Detroit River, for those who haven't done it before, what do we mean by jigging? Do we mean casting? Do we mean maybe a method of something else? Vertical jigging, whoever said that, exactly. So what we're talking about, for those who haven't done it before, when we're vertical jigging, what we do is when we're on the boat, we're matching the current speed on the bottom. We're not matching the current speed on top of the water. What I mean by that is the surface of the water on top is going to move a little bit quicker than the surface of the water down below. So typically what people do is they use a bow mount trolling motor to slow themselves down in the current, or they use maybe it's method of they have a transom trolling motor. Some people like to back troll with the kicker of their main motor in some of the smaller boats. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to slow your presentation down. And what these people do is they take their jig, usually in these areas around here, they're using 3/4 to 1 ounce normally. They're dropping it straight down to the bottom until they touch the bottom. You'll see their line coil up. And when they do that, they start jigging and they keep close contact with the bottom. Now a lot of people, when they're keeping their boat straight up and down, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but what they're doing is they chase their line and to keep themselves straight up and down. Now that's kind of a basic introduction to vertical jigging, if you didn't know what that was. But before we talk more, terminal tackle, rods, jigs, plastics, that matter, we need to understand why these walleyes, they come to this body of water and where they come from and how they migrate through. So everyone around the world is pretty familiar, if they like walleyes, they're extremely familiar with Lake Erie. Lake Erie, arguably, for some people, for some other people it's not arguably, it's considered the greatest walleye lake in the world. Now, just to the north a little bit, you go right out the door here a little bit, we have Lake St. Clair that's got a phenomenal walleye fishery. You go north there a little bit, we get into Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron, and that is one heck of a fishery itself, one of the best in the world. So if you think about these three bodies of water, we have from Lake Huron to Lake Erie, we have one main river system with a river basin in between, which is Lake St. Clair. It starts with the St. Clair River, comes right down from Lake St. Clair right to Lake Erie. You have millions of walleyes that are coming through these areas to reach their spawning, or they're migrating through to get to other lakes. We have fish that come from Lake Erie that spawn on the reefs to the south down there. We also have fish that come from Lake Erie, go into the Detroit River. They might bypass the Detroit River. They might go further north. We have fish from Lake Huron and Lake St. Clair that might enter the Detroit River. They might go further south. We have fish that come from Lake Huron, might bypass St. Clair River. We have fish vice versa that might go from Erie, might go up to the St. Clair River. Now you might be asking, why am I telling you where these fish are coming from, where they're going? Well, you have to understand, when we're talking walleye in these two river systems, we're not talking just spawning walleyes. We're talking walleyes that are spawning. We're talking walleyes that are migrating, they're transient. We're talking walleyes that are pre-spawn, and we're talking walleyes that are post-spawn. So if you think about that, you have fish in very different attitudes in their migration process as they go from to their spawning grounds. They get to their spawning grounds, spawning, and when they're done. Now, when these walleyes come in the river, It has a little bit more to do than with water temperature. It has to do with a lot of your amount of daylight you're getting. These walleyes come into the river to spawn, and they don't all drop their eggs at one time. These walleye, they come in, they like any other fish, they kind of have you're going to have your fish that come in early, you're going to have your fish that come in, they spawn, you're going to have your main bulk of your run, which here, many people would say is probably from, main part of our spawn here would probably be, well, you guys know, you guys are all out there jigging. 3rd week of April, 2nd week of April through 1st week of May is probably when we have the most amount of fish getting their spawning done around here, sometimes earlier. But you have fish that, like I mentioned, you got fish that are in different attitudes. So to do that, you need to understand what these fish are attracted to. Now, as John mentioned, here locally, these are not the only bodies of water that have the same attitudes as the walleyes here. Now, what I mean by that is we have walleye here in these rivers, as I mentioned, tens of millions. We get very, very, very spoiled. There's not very many other places in the world. There's not any other places in the world you can go out and do the damage on walleyes that you can do out here. So a lot of times we take for granted, we're out there, we kind of go out there with the headset sometimes thinking, I'm gonna go out there and I'm probably gonna put a hurting on them pretty good today, you know. Well, wind's good, water clarity's good, you know, my buddies have been doing really good. But not too often do most people understand why on particular days or particular times of year, why they're doing so well in certain areas. Now, we see a lot of people, they're out fishing these channels, these river channels. You see a lot of people fishing along the seawalls. You see a lot of people fishing eddies. You know, you see them fishing underneath bridges. You see a different variety of things. Now, if you take what we talked about, these walleye are moving from these lakes constantly, especially in the spring and fall. You think about where these fish are going, what attracts them, how do they want to move through these river systems as they're trying to find the right spawning habitat? Well, number one, they're going to follow shipping channels in our river, mainly because they got close access to deep water, but they also can follow break lines. If you guys have been on your boat, you guys go straight off, you know, your boat launch, get into the river, you guys might hit, you know, some of the stuff closer to shore, and you get close to that shipping channel, and what does your graph usually do? It usually drops straight down, right? And then you get to the other side of it and it comes straight back up, right? So those fish, they follow these break lines, they follow these deep river channels. So a lot of these fish that are being caught in this channel, these are fish that are moving from spawning areas to spawning areas. These are fish that are moving from maybe where they want to get to spawn. Now, we get into some other areas. We have our pre-spawn fish. Now, your first couple waves of fish that come into the river, what these fish are going to do, they're going to do something similar. They're going to follow breaks, but they're going to follow these breaks off these shipping channels, off these deep bodies of water. They're going to follow these sets of breaks, and they're going to move up near flats. Now, when I say flats, I mean flats that are vast in size. A lot of people think they find a small little spot on their graph, and that's gonna, you know, it's gonna be like the money spot. We're gonna get a big fish there. That's a big fish. There's probably not a lot of people targeting that on a small flat. It's not always the case. The vast majority of the time, more area is more likable to walleyes, and these bigger walleyes, they're smart. They're going to remember where they've spawned before. They're going to know where they feel safe. They're going to get into areas where they know they can get in, do their business, leave. These walleyes are, like I mentioned, they're going to come up off these breaks. They're going to follow these breaks, stay close to deep water. Now we're talking pre-spawn. These fish are going to stay close to deep water. They're going to follow these breaks up. They're going to settle along somewhere where they can feel comfortable on these breaks, and they're going to settle close to hard bottom flats. Now, why hard bottom flats? Does anybody know, maybe, why it would be a hard bottom flat these fish would be relating next to, as opposed to maybe a mud flat or something that's softer bottom?
That's what the eggs stick to.
Right, that's what these walleyes are looking for. These walleyes are looking for gravel, they're looking for rocks. You know, a mix of, sometimes they've been known to look for areas that, you know, that are mix of sand, mix of some other things. But these walleyes, there's certain areas in the river that have all of these things close, right? Now, we think about a couple of the big name spots in the river. A lot of people love to fish the tip of Fighting Island, right? Tip of Fighting Island gets really, really busy certain times of the year. It's a very good early spot. It's a good later in the year spot. But when it comes to being an early spot, it's got everything your early pre-spawn walleyes are going to want. We see a lot of big walleyes get caught off that tip of Fighting Island every single year when the water clarity and everything allows and everything lines up, like everything else when it comes to fishing. But we look at this, it's got everything these walleyes want. Now, if you were just out fishing and let's say you come out of one of these boat ramps, you see a whole line of boats, you see nets going, you know, you see guys with their rods way up here, everyone's laughing, having a great time. You see that a lot in the river. But if you went out there and you started fishing and you hammered them, you know, you hammered them, your buddies are out there, you guys are hammering them. We want to make sure to become a better fisherman, why do we believe we did good? What kind of fish are we catching? Are we catching, you know, transient fish moving from spot to spot? Are we catching staging fish? Well, you got a really good thing on your graphs nowadays. If you're fortunate enough to have electronics, you have waypoint buttons. You start hitting these waypoints. You start figuring out where these fish are moving. You start figuring out where they're at on your graph compared to the break lines. And you can kind of understand where your fish are at, right? We've had days on the river where we've been fishing, trying to fish pre-spawn fish. We can see them on side imaging, and they won't bite. We can't get them to bite. We might get a couple here or there, but we just can't get together a good program. But we might find, as we keep fishing these certain areas, we might start catching a different, a fish, but in a different attitude process. What I mean by that is a different stage of the spawning process. We see some areas here, especially when we get towards peak time, we see some areas where you'll start catching fish that are, you know, females. You start catching females, you see their big belly, you can feel it, and it's very firm. These fish aren't ready to drop yet. And, you know, you might throw that fish in the live well, you might let it go if you already got your limit. And you keep fishing, and you might catch another fish 10 minutes later. It looks like this fish has been spawned out for, you know, a week. This fish, you know, might be spawned out enough to already have 2 or 3 meals under its belt. So we use the waypoints. We find, you know, where in these areas we're catching these fish. We can find, you know, if we're catching fish tight to breaks and they're pre-spawned, hard, full of eggs, we know our pre-spawn fish are in the mood to eat today. You start catching your post-spawn fish on the backside of these spawning flats, starting to drop back towards the lake where they're at in these feeding areas. You might say, hey, there must have been a lot of fish the last couple days that laid eggs, and those fish today they're chowing. Now, another thing when we're talking about pre-spawn walleyes is fish year-round. They have a couple things that rule their brain 24/7. Number one, at all times, number one is survivability, eating. They're sustaining themselves. When we're out in the boat, some of the first things we do is we go out and we mark for bait. How many guys usually go out if they're going out walleye fishing, whether it's on the lake or on the river, they go out and they look for bait first? Raise the hands. Anybody go out and look for bait right away? Okay, exactly. Why do we look for bait?
Fish are going to be there.
Fish are going to be there. That's where they're going to be, exactly. Now, when they get close to spawning and when they're spawning is now their number one priority. Spawning trumps everything at that moment. Now, that doesn't mean it trumps everything for a long period of time. That just means at that moment, those fish put spawning and breeding ahead of everything else. That's the only time of the year they do that. The only time of the year they do that. Now, as much time we spent into looking for bait year round, these fish, the number one priority is going to be spawning habitat. It's going to be the first thing you're going to want to look for, especially if you're trying to find big fish. You're going to want to find spawning habitat. You're going to want to find, as we mentioned, spawning habitat that has less pressure, preferably, to find these bigger fish. But spawning habitat for these big fish is, and I can't stress that enough, is going to be the number one thing when these fish are about to drop, when they're dropping, and when they had just dropped. That's what they're gluing to. Now, as we start to slip onto the backside, we start talking post-spawn walleyes, and I don't like talking post-spawn walleyes in March, but we talk post-spawn walleyes in March. The first thing these fish do is they just lost a lot of weight. You know, they lost a lot of weight, especially these females. The males, they waste a lot of energy. As we mentioned, they're migrating from long distances. So what's the first thing they're going to do? First thing they're going to do is go look for food when they're done. So when you're in the river situation like we got here in the Detroit River and St. Clair River, where's your bait going to be hanging out? Preferably, your bait's going to be hanging out. It's going to be hanging out shallow areas, breaks from the current. We look here locally, a lot of our resident fish here in the Detroit River, one of the first spots a lot of guys start to fish for these fish is the Belle Isle Bridge. And what do we got in the Belle Isle Bridge? We got pillars from that bridge that create eddies. Those eddies create vast habitat for bait for those fish wintering over in the river to spawn. So we look at the Detroit River, we look at the St. Clair River. You start looking at some of these spots on your guys' graphs, you guys are going to start to put together 2 + 2 per se. You're going to be able to start seeing some similarities between some of these spots you guys do well in now, you know, for your pre-spawn time coming up and your spawning time and your post-spawn time. Now, sometimes these spots are the same, but they're not always the same. They're not always the same. There's a lot of spots we can look at, these cuts in between these islands we have on these rivers. We have a lot of islands, and on these islands we have a lot of cuts, we have a lot of flats. These flats and these cuts, they create a lot of current breaks, and these fish, like I mentioned, they just expounded a lot of energy spawning. You know, their bellies are really empty at this point. We mentioned that they put food second for the only time of the year they do that at that moment. So the first thing they're doing is looking for food, like we mentioned. These fish are going to drop to the very first thing that they can find closest to where they're spawning. So when we get closer into May, end of May, or middle of May, you start seeing most of your fish, in the latter half of April too. They start spawning. We start looking for spots near spawning habitat that hold spots for these bait to be around. That's when we'd be looking for eddies. That's when we'd be looking for off these flats, these walleyes, hug into these breaks as we mentioned, because now they're going to be migrating back out to the lakes. We're looking for where these walleyes are going to be laying eating bait. So now you're adding another piece to the puzzle. Gotta look for bait, looking for post-spawn walleyes. And you put that piece of the puzzle at those times of the year, those things are going to make fishing a lot easier on some days. God, I can't say all days it's fishing. You know, fishing's like playing cards. But we all love fishing, right? We all love it. That's why we're here talking about these fish in the river a month before it really gets going down there. We love it, right? So we go out there, we want to spend as much time as possible chasing these fish and less time in dead water. That's what all this does. It eliminates a lot of fish in dead water, which it's not very productive. Now that we've kind of talked a little bit about migration, what these fish are looking for, we're going to talk a little bit about rods. Like I mentioned, we talked a little bit about vertical jigging for those who haven't done it before. Now we're going to talk a little bit about rods. Now rods, it's all preference. I'm not going to tell you, you know, you got to use a 6-footer or 7-footer or 6.5-footer or a St. Croix or Loomis, or I'm not going to tell you that. You guys need to fish what feels good in your hands. You guys have to fish with what you feel comfortable with and what you have confidence in. That's the most important thing with fishing. Yeah, what your wallet likes, yeah, that's, today's day and age, what your wallet likes is huge. Now, personally, I like something that stays closer to the boat. I get a rod that stays a little bit shorter. This one I got right here, this is a 5.9. It's a little bit short for what some guys like to use. I like it when I'm running the trolling motor. It can help multiple people. I could stay closer to my bait. You know, I'm not sticking my 7-foot rod way out here, telling the guy at the 6-foot rod in the back, hey, I'm vertical, you know, figure it out. I got a smaller rod. It helps me keep the boat straighter a little bit easier. But what you're looking for is looking for a medium to a medium heavy rod with fast action. We're picking up to 1 ounce jigs. Some guys use even heavier, especially in the St. Clair River. But you need to be able to pick these jigs up, you know, and be able to set the hook in up to 50 feet of water, sometimes deeper in some areas, you know, with enough backbone to be able to drive the hook home. Now, when it comes to a reel, I would say my personal preference, spend the money on the rod, save the money on the reel. You don't really need anything fancy for these walleyes. What you're going to want to spend the money on is a rod to be able to stay in close contact with the bottom. Anybody can do it with a rod that's not sensitive when there's no wind and it's glass outside. But if you go out on a day when there's a little bit of wind and you got the wind in your face, or you got, you know, a crosswind, get a little bit of wind in your line, it's a heck of a lot tougher with a cheaper rod. There's some really, really well designed blanks and rods out there that aren't too much money. Too much money is relative, I understand that. But when it comes to rods for this type of fishing, there's some very good blanks out there, you know, that you can get for even under $100 that are out there in the market. Now for line, I like to run, this is one thing I meant to grab back there. I like to run 6 to 10 pound braid on my setup. Preferably on this one, I got 8-pound braid. I use Power Pro or Suffix 832, whatever I can get my hands on at the time. Yeah, line's kind of hard to get a hold of sometimes right now, especially if you forget last second like I do. But one thing I do like to do is I like to cut sections of my line off if I can get away with it, or flip the entire spool of line. What I mean by that is taking all the line off this reel onto another reel or another spool, flipping it around. That works really good. You can double the line or double the value out of your line. And another thing is, personally, this is something I personally do. A lot of you guys, I'm sure, don't do this. I'm not saying it's better, but I run a leader. This one's a little bit long. I run a leader for a couple things. Number one, like I said, I feel more confident having a clear leader. Number two, if I got a weak spot in my braid, let's say I've been jigging at 35 or 40 feet all day, and I got a small nick, you know, in my guide and it nicked it, I'm not putting 30 feet of line in the water, you know, a couple times a year, or you know, more than that. I'm just breaking off maybe a jig, or sometimes, you know, bending the hook on the jig, coming up. Usually I run to an 8 or 10 pound fluorocarbon leader. It's usually what I'm running. But we go from that, we go from the rod, we go to the tackle bag. I'm gonna grab a couple of these baits that everybody uses.
The main thing you want to do is when you're going to mono with the extra there, is with your braid and you're snagging, especially downriver, braid doesn't break. So you're going to sit there all day trying to get you're going to break your rod is what you're going to do. So
yeah, you can.
If you go to mono, especially down by Trent, you go to mono, that's going to break off.
Mm-hmm.
And you can retie right away in your bag.
Mm-hmm.
Save yourself the rod.
Yep. What I'm going to do, I might repeat some things throughout the night, but the camera can't pick up what they're saying without the microphone. So what he said was, he kind of reiterated what the mono or fluorocarbon does. If you get snagged, braid doesn't break. You know, especially if you're by yourself and it's bouncy, you know, it might go up underneath the boat. You might have a hard time breaking, you know, 10 pound braid off. Fluoro is going to break a little bit easier. I know breaking jigs off hurts some guys and they cringe at thinking it, but breaking a jig off, you know, it's a lot better than breaking a rod or something else, getting line caught in your trolling motor. So it just makes life a lot easier. We're going to do questions at the end. Is that okay? All right, sweet. So, number one, everybody that fishes the river here locally, St. Clair and Detroit. Everyone fishes these finesse minnows, number one. Again, I know a lot of you guys have seen these before, Lunker City finesse. We do have some here who have not done this type of fishing before. That's just going to be a 4-inch minnow imitation soft plastic. They come in different colors. They got a bunch of them on the rack over there. They got all this stuff on the rack over there. The next thing is the wind-out worms. These are, they vary from 3.5, 3 3/4 to 4, maybe a little bit over 4 inches. Everyone here locally, they've seen these, use these a time or two. Even some of the bass guys have. Then we move over into some other stuff. What I got here, these are just a smaller minnow profile, similar to those finesse minnows. This is 3 3/4. Sometimes, especially in the waters, clean. Sometimes a smaller profile makes a big difference. Even I've had days actually when the water's really dirty and we're keeping baits close to bottom where the fish are sometimes at. The smaller, even in the dirty water, the smaller profile is shined several times. And then the next thing is, I know a lot of guys use these in dirty water. They work good in clear water too, is paddle tails. These are walleye assassins. A lot of guys like these. I have a box full of them for casting and for jigging. They work really well. They come in a bunch of different colors. They got a paddle tail on the back. They add a little bit of vibration in the water for fish to see it, kind of hone in on it when the water's a little bit dirtier. Those are a couple, the basic, there's a lot of other baits out there you could use. Those are just a couple of the most popular baits, that people out there use. Now, as we mentioned before, I'm going to go a little bit into my tackle bag. We talked about being really productive on the water, and it doesn't stop with when you're on the water. Maybe you can only get out once a week, maybe you can only get out once a month, or maybe way less than that, some of us. You want your time in the water to be as productive as possible. So it starts with, first is going to be, staying pretty organized. What I like to do, I'm going to try to tilt this up to show you guys. I got a tackle bag. In this tackle bag, we have labeled, we got a finesse minnows, wind-out worms, jigs, some other different types of plastics up here. So when I'm on the water, I can just pick one out. Let's say I wanted to fish finesse minnows, I can pick this out, and I got all my finesse minnows right here. Another thing, whether you buy them or you make them, I make my own stingers. I buy some of them. I go to the fly shop just because they sell these flat fly boxes and they hold a lot of stingers. And, whoops, if I can get this open. I tie my stingers and I put them in here. I'm running low on this one. But you can see, you could fit a lot of stingers in this little fly box. And it's a lot better than some of the other ways out there to organize them. That's what I like to do. I keep 2 of them in here. These ones do crack, but I mean, they stay pretty organized in here. It's super nice on the water. These are a couple years old now. So we go into bait selection. The first thing is we talk about what depth of water we fishing in, where we fishing, what's the current like, what's the wind like, all the basic necessities you set up to a spot. Very rarely do I just have a jig on and use the same jig from yesterday. What I mean by that is if I'm fishing, a little bit deeper water, I'm probably going to start with a 3/4. That's what this is. I'm going to start with the 3/4. I like going as light as possible. When the walleyes, when they suck those jigs in their mouth when they hit them, they're sucking all the water around that jig. They're sucking everything around that's in the area of that jig. So I like to go as light as possible because the lighter jig you use, the further back they're going to take that bait. So usually if I'm fishing deeper water, I mean 35, 35 plus, I'm going to start with a 3/4. If I'm fishing deeper than 45, I'm probably going to use a 1 ounce unless I can get away with something lighter. But when we're going shallower now, these walleyes, when you imagine them in a river setting, they're not always belly to the bottom. Not always. Sometimes these fish come up a little bit. They suspend, you know, sometimes maybe a couple feet. When we're picking these jigs up, we got to remember, we're matching the speed, the current speed on the bottom, right? Current speed on top might be mile, you know, 1.2 to a mile and a half an hour. That's as fast as we troll out in the lake, to put it in that perspective. And it doesn't seem like that when we're out there. So what we have a tendency to do sometimes is, if we're looking at the water, it don't really look like you're moving. You know, so you start jigging, you know, and you don't really pay attention to, you think you're just, you know, jigging straight up and down. When your jig's moving from here, you know, when you pick it up and set it down, it's hopping. It's hopping on the bottom, right? So what a lot of people do, and this is what a lot of beginners do, is they set their jig down, they hit bottom, and then they keep dropping it down, and then they pick it back up. And they drop the bottom, you know, and they put slack in their line every time they hit the bottom, you know. And what that's doing is your jig, every time it hits the bottom and you're drifting, your line's getting on a, you know, more and more of an angle. And you're gonna be going further and further and further down. What you don't want is to be anything but vertical in the river, because when you are not vertical, the first thing that happens is your jig is not going up and down anymore. Your jig's now, instead of going up and down, your jig's gonna start, you know, it's gonna start slowly being smaller and smaller hops until it's just a drag, and you're dragging it and you're just pulling gunk on the bottom. I don't know about you guys, I don't want no gunk on the bottom from the Detroit River. I don't want to take it off of my hands or anything, but that's how you lose jigs. So staying vertical, touching the bottom, you know. If you swim these jigs, it's, you know, as long as you stay close to the bottom, these walleyes are going to find them, they're going to see them. A lot of times, we have a lot of days where keeping the bait up off the bottom for an extended period of time is way better than staying close to the bottom. You know, I call it, you know, you're swimming the jig, you know, I'll pick it up off the bottom, I know where bottom's at, and I might, you know, kind of give it just a little swimming action, and or pause it, and you'll feel them hit it. You know, it's on a tight line, you'll feel them hit it.
Last year was like that a lot.
Yeah.
You just hold it there and go wham!
Yeah, you hold it there and you can feel them. It's cool when you can feel them hit it like that. But, you know, keeping all these things in mind, these are all things we can do differently every time we're out there. Using our graphs, using our minds, it's a lot. It's a lot. You could forget very easily. But that's why we're always talking about it. You know, it's all good reminders, right? Like we mentioned, we have different jigs for these situations. We think about when the water gets dirtier. We think about when the water gets cleaner. These fish see a little bit differently. So we go to cleaner water, what type of bait or what type of plastic, what type of profile would be something we'd want to go with, right? Well, usually the first thing I do is I try to go, when the water's really clean, I try to go natural. A lot of these fish, what they're doing is they're silhouetting these baits. So I try to go dark colors first. That's what I do. You know, these fish see a lot of perch. They see a lot of gobies. They see a lot of those little log perch. You'll snag on your hooks every now and again when you're jigging. They see a lot of these fish down there. So that's kind of something that these fish are used to seeing. Now when the water gets more color to it, I tend to go to the darkest colors in my box. I have, you know, like those worms, solid black worms, your real dark, bigger profile, even paddle tails, because brown, black, those show up in water way better in dirtier water, low light conditions than bright colors do. That's a fact. So take a look at my box. I fish dark colored worms in dirty water almost exclusively. Usually, and the only thing I'll do is if it's really dirty, I might tip it with a shiner, even though I hate doing that, just to bulk it up a little bit. But, I mean, see, these are just different profiles, worms I got in my box. These are gonna be the first thing I put on the water's dirty. I'm gonna fish these worms, or go in here.
When are you recommending like the oranges and stuff?
Your oranges, now brighter colors,
I thought it was for muddy.
Yeah, I mean, they'll work, they could work in muddy water. I'm not saying that they're not gonna work, but what's gonna show up the best to the fish on the bottom is gonna be dark colored baits. Now your brighter colors, usually brighter days, that's what the, it's what the saying is, brighter days, brighter colors, darker days, darker colors. Darker water, underneath the surface, fish can't tell if it's dark outside or if the water is dirty per se. It's dark, visibility in the water is low. So silhouetting, with those darker colors when the water is dirty is huge.
Like a real heavy overcast, we're gonna go with
darker colors when it's darker, darker, your gobies, stuff like that. That doesn't mean don't use other colors. I mean, fish prove us wrong every single day, every single year, right? These are just kind of guidelines to go by. Now some of these brighter colors, I got some antifreeze. Everyone's got Pimp Daddy, something similar like that in their box. This happens to be Pimp Daddy, swim bait. I've had some really good days with these when the water's dirty. Those are just some color choices I use depending on the water. But also, put that away. When it comes to water, depth comes into play too. Walleye are low light feeders. So by low light feeders, we mean, dusk, dawn, if the water's clean. You get a little bit of stain in the water, they'll feed throughout the day. But if you're in a little bit shallower water, there's gonna be more light penetration. So these fish, they're gonna react to colors differently in shallower water than they would in deeper water, We talked about the breaks a little bit earlier. We fish a lot of these spots where the bottom goes from 40 feet. Next thing you know, you're in 8 feet of water from the current pushing it down. Now, you see how quick you move? You could have somebody, in talking distance from me to the rod rack. They could be in completely different depth of water than you. Now, they could be your buddy. They could be yelling over to you, hey man, you gotta throw Pimp Daddy on. We're just hammering them on Pimp Daddy. You might put a different color. You might run Pimp Daddy. You might be in a little bit shallower water than they are, and guess what? You might have a little bit different light penetration. It sounds small, but it's big. You might have different light penetration. Those fish might not react to that color the same if you're in 20 feet shallower than your friends are. Now, you might slide out there. You might do just fine. But if you switch colors, knowing your situations, your water clarity, the weather, you switch these colors, you'll understand really quick, your adjustments you make and how it affects, the fish you're seeing. But like we said, it all starts with finding the right fish first. It all starts with finding the right spots with fish, first, as we said, to be productive. Now, we talked a little bit about, your rod choice, reel choice, line choice, jig choice, everything like that. The last thing, and this is something I kind of forgot about, I showed the stingers, was stinger preference per se. It's a little bit of a small thing, but I know I've been asked this question before, and I'm sure some people are going to have some questions on it. The way I make my stingers is a lot of guys, they like to tie a knot, kind of like a slip-like knot with a bobber stop, and they like to slip those on so they're reusable. That's really cool. It's a really cool way to do it. I used to do it like that. What I found is over time of that sliding up and down your hook, catching fish, they end up breaking. So, because that line's rubbing on your hook. So what I do is, the cost is very minimal. Instead of buying bobber stops, I buy split rings. And I go to Home Depot or Lowe's or Ace, and I buy a jar, not the spray can, I buy a jar of Plastidip. And what I do is when I have my stingers tied up, I tie onto that split ring and I dip it in Plastidip. And I'm able to reuse that as many times until the stingers. John's holding up one back there. He's got a bunch of them. Yeah, exactly like that. Yeah, I kind of took the idea from them. I used theirs and I liked it. But what you can do is you use this as long as this stays intact. Your line, you use like heavier line. I use probably 16 to 20 pound or 17 to 20 pound. As long as this line's good and your hooks aren't bent and they're good, and this gets worn out, you just re-dip it back in the Plastidip and you're good to go. You can put it right back in your box. You can use them a lot, and you're not rubbing line on your hook. It stays pretty pretty good. So that's the way I do it. I can hammer these out really fast. The plastic dip does not take long to dry at all. It does have like a chemical smell, so I suggest doing it outside or in a garage or somewhere ventilated. That would be the only thing I do. But other than that, when it comes to these fish, you know, we could sit here and talk all day, but these fish, bottom line is these fish are going to relate to something. These fish are going to have different attitudes. These fish are going to be where they want to be. These fish are never going to be where you want them to be. Never. These fish are never going to adjust their patterns because we want them somewhere. So as long as we keep in mind what these fish are looking for certain times of year, certain times of their mood, whether it's, you know, they're on their summer patterns, they're on their fall patterns. As we're talking about today, they're on their spawning patterns. There's a lot of attitude changes that these fish go through in a very short time. As long as we keep those things in mind, then it's definitely going to help us a lot on the water. Now, I know we talked about a lot of stuff. A lot of you guys probably already know a lot of this stuff. Some of you might not know anything, but I figured this would be a good time to open it up to any questions, Q&A, anything like that. If you guys had any questions or anything?
What's your preference for stinger hook size? Some guys like to use the little size 10 hooks, other guys like to use a bigger hook. Do you have a
Okay.
preference?
So he asked if I have a preference for stinger hook size. I do and I don't. I like 8s and 10s. I've gone more towards 8s, mainly because I'm usually trying to target a little bit bigger fish. So for it seems to help. They seem to hold a little bit better for me. I still have 10s in my box, but if I were to be, I can tell you this, if I were to be filling up both these fly boxes tomorrow, I'd probably be buying only 8s. That's probably what I'd be doing. You do pick up a little bit more gunk. That's something to keep in mind. If you don't like picking the little zebra mussels off your hook, or seaweed or gunk, go with the 10. It's going to be a lot less to pick up, but I like the 8s. They seem to hold fish just a little bit better for me.
What about, you know, you're talking a lot about the finesse, but how do you try to pair the jig with the finesse, you know, like color lights?
Now I do. I haven't seen too much where jig colors mattered for me per se, but I have seen a lot. I've seen this where contrasting your jig head with your color, your profile, whatever bait you're using, it's made a huge difference. You see a lot of guys, they'll tell you antifreeze jig, black worm. You'll see a lot of guys, they'll tell you maybe chartreuse and orange, or maybe a green with a black worm. You see a lot of guys using like bright jig heads with more natural or darker colored bodies. Walleye love contrasting colors. You know, you see a lot of the crankbaits and the walleyes, you know, the spinners or crawler harnesses.
But you spend more time with you're more concentrating yourself with the color of the
profile. Yeah, I'm looking more for on the color of the plastic and the profile, what the fish are looking for. Yeah, that's more of what I'm looking for.
I mean, like you can see blue ice jig and a blue ice, you know, worm. You know?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, when like I said, you're going 1.5 miles an hour downriver, I don't think a fish is spending too much time saying, yeah, that jig head is black. I'm not going for that. You know.
Okay.
I don't think they are. No, but like I said, these fish are silhouetting a lot of these baits. So that was actually a good question. It's probably something I should have covered. These fish are silhouetting a lot of these baits. So profile, for the most part, can't say always when it comes to fishing. For the most part, profile is going to be what these fish are looking at. You're going to find some days that they're going to be on a certain profile, whether it's one of these 4 types of baits we mentioned or the other 100 that guys are using out on the river. There's going to be, they're all going to have their days where that profile that day is going to be something those fish want.
You would switch profile before color?
I tend to, usually if you got a couple guys on the boat, usually try to have one guy fishing a worm, one guy fishing, you know, a finesse minnow, one guy fishing a swing bait. Try to, you know, usually with that, I'll have one guy maybe throwing a black worm, one guy throwing maybe like a blue ice finesse, one guy throwing like a pimp daddy, you know, paddle tails. Cover all your bases really quick. Most of us are jigging with a couple guys in the boat, so makes it a little bit easier.
Does the shape of your jig matter to you? Like is it round or shape to the head at all? Or?
So, for me, It doesn't matter too much. I do not see a bite difference. I will say maybe finding the bottom is a little bit easier with a jig that's got more of a point to it, cuts the current a little bit better. My box has both. I have round ball and I have the ones that, you know, got a little bit of a point to them, the fish head or current cutters, whatever you want to call them. I got them both, so, you know.
Is there a time that you would use, you mentioned tipping your jig with a minnow. Is there a time that you would use just a minnow and not the plastics? Or do you always use plastics and attach the minnow to them?
That's something I would probably do when the water's a little bit colder. It's not something I do too much. The only time I'm using a jig and live bait would be in a lake setting, maybe a leech or something like that, you know. But jig and a minnow is not something I haven't done it, so I would not be the guy to ask on that. If I had to take a guess, I'd say maybe a little bit earlier in the year when the fish are focusing more on scent, you know, something like that.
What kind of minnow? Shiners?
Shiners, yeah. And a lot of people don't know is when the water's really cold, walleye aren't the only fish, but many fish, their eyesight when the water's colder gets better, which is why a lot of times shiners matter. Sometimes it's not smell. A lot of guys, they'll run gel and stuff and scents on their plastics and they don't see an immediate difference. A lot of times it's the eyesight, it's the profile, like we mentioned, a little bit bigger profile. That's what, that goes into part of a lot of it.
You mentioned for the braid, 6 to 8 pound, is that true 6 to 8 pound braid, or is it like the equivalent diameter? That seems a little light. I'm newer, so.
Oh, okay. So he asked if the braid I mentioned, like 6 to 8 or 10 pound is true, or if that's just like its diameter. What I mean by that is I mean the actual rating on the box. It seems really light, but I promise you, you run 10 pound braid, or you run 8 pound braid and you run like a 12 pound leader, that fluoro is probably going to break before the braid does. That's probably going to happen. It's stronger than you think.
That's around like, what, 4 pound diameter?
Yeah, I don't got a box in front of me to see, but the diameter on 8 pound braid, which is why we use braid, it's a lot more sensitive, but the diameter on it's so small you can stay vertical way easier. But when it comes to 6, 8, 10 pound, guys, I say that as just kind of like a, you know, put the blanket out and generalize it. That's what most guys use is 6 to 10 pound.
How do you tie the leader to the ring line?
How do I do it? I do it a super complicated way because I'm a perfectionist and it'll bug me. But I do a blood knot or an Alberto knot. It takes a little bit longer, but I tie them a lot. I'm not too worried about line twist, but it makes it invisible and I can reel it through the guides. A barrel swivel, if I reel it up to the tip through the guides one time, I might chip it. I'm not in for that, so.
I know a lot of times, and like me and my buddy that we fish together, you know, his line will be straight up and down, and we got the same kind of line, and I'm just, you know, 8 foot away or 6 feet away, and it seems like mine's going this way and his is going that way. Is there just got to get in sync or
Get in sync, which way is the wind blowing, you know?
Well, I mean, you know, he's straight up and down, and I'm not. I don't know.
Well, there could be a variety of things. If you're using the same size jig, watch cadence. Like I mentioned, if you touch the bottom a little bit, even if it's just a fraction of a second, over 100 to 150 jigs, that starts adding up and your jig goes further and further downriver. You can slowly try to bring it up, but it's way easier to fall back than it is to bring it back. So that's why when you're dropping your jig, you drop it straight down. Don't do any of the giving it slack.
Right.
Just drop it straight down, watch it. As soon as you see that you're on bottom, click it, get it up bottom, find bottom.
Okay.
How often do you pass up maybe your number 1 or number 2 spot on a day just because of the boat traffic?
How often do I pass my go-to my number 1 or number 2 spots? Not often. Not often. No. No, usually what I do is if I see a lot of people on a spot that I was thinking about all night when I was going to bed to fish in the morning, usually what I do is I'm going to figure out where everyone's fishing. You know, they're usually going to be working a certain break or a certain point or a certain line. Especially first thing in the morning, my first thing is going to be, hey, if these guys are all working, let's say I'm in a spot and I'm on a break between 15 and 25 foot of water, these guys are all working 20 to 23 feet. I'm going to go up inside of them. You know, I'm going to try to be the tightest guy to shore, or, you know, tightest guy to the flat, the shallowest part. I'm going to try to get on that. Or if there's nobody on, you know, the exact structure I want to fish, I'm going to try to hit that. You know, it depends on the spot per se. But usually, if I'm looking for fish during the spawning period, I'm usually going to push up shallower than most people. If that doesn't work, then the next thing I would be is I would come and go deeper. That's after I have, you know, side imaged my spot. I go through and I side image it, try to see where the fish are all laying at. That's just would be the first thing I do once I got to that spot.
Talk about going super shallow early season for some of these fish.
So a lot of these fish, they spawn in shallower waters than a lot of us want to believe. A lot of guys, they go right out and they think walleyes, 20 feet of water, 15 feet, you know, 12, 15 feet of water at least. We had I was fishing with a friend in a tournament a couple years ago, and we were on a pretty good bite of fish on Lake Erie. This was right around Easter. We were trolling. This was not jigging, but it's the same concept. We were very close to the river, but we were on a bite, trolling with planer boards, bandits, huskies, perfect tens. We were in 7 to 8 feet of water, running boards, and we probably could have went shallower, but I couldn't run. I didn't want to run baits, you know, any closer to the boards, just because the water was a little bit clean. But I couldn't even tell you how many fish we caught. I mean, we caught so many fish in 7 to 9 feet of water this day with other boats around, but the other boats this day happen to be working 15 to 18 feet of water. So that's usually the sweet spot, but we were able to scoot in just a hair, and we were able to put a hurting on some fish. Actually, one of the fish we got that day was, I can't remember the exact weight of it. It was on the scale, I think it was high 13s on the scale, but that fish came up less than 9 feet of water. So, I mean, less than 9 feet of water, running baits 12 feet behind a planer board.
Does that have to do with spawning or
those fish were spawning?
Temperature, or like bait fish being up there, and that's why they're moving up?
Are you talking about the shallow water?
The shallow water, like what's driving the fish up there? Is it the bait, the temperature of the water, or the fact that that's where they're spawning?
A little bit of both, but that's just where the fish were spawning. You could see them on the side imaging. If we were like fun fishing, we probably could have spot locked and casted to them, because if I had a TV, I'd pull up some shots of the side imaging, but you could see them like all on the left side of the boat, just piled in. I mean, they look like little grains of rice just piled all on the side imaging, all up in there. We just weren't casting because we were in a tournament, we were trying to cover water. That's all.
I'm looking at the graph. I know you said like spotting bait fish. Can you see them on your graph, or are you looking down in the water? How are you spotting the bait fish? Will it show it?
So he asked how I spot bait fish when I'm looking at my electronics. That's a really good question. So if you're fishing deeper water, your 2D and your regular looking at your depth of the water column works great. If you're in deeper water, but the shallower water you are in, the smaller the cone angle is on your transducer. So what I like to go to, especially out here on Lake St. Clair, some of those shallow spawning spots on Saginaw Bay or Lake Erie, is I go to side imaging. It's a great tool. Side imaging, you could shoot 200 feet away on both sides of your boat. You could see, it gives you like a layout, and you could see, further away from it gives you basically a bigger picture of where these fish are at. You can cover water a little bit easier, but you could see bait on your side imaging. But I will tell you this, if you see fish on your 2D and you're in shallow water, your cone's so small it's probably loaded. I will tell you that. If you're marking fish on your 2D in shallow water, there's probably a lot of fish around.
Yeah, I don't have the side imaging things.
A lot of people don't. That just keep that in mind. You know, your cone angle's really, really tight. So when, yeah, you start seeing, you know, anything, you start seeing it, you know, you'll know.
Is there such a thing as too much bait fish?
Oh. I'm trying to be a little bit better with repeating the question. I know you guys can't hear anything. If you guys can't hear, you miss a question, just speak up. But he asked if there's ever a time when I think that there's too much bait fish or too much bait around. Sometimes, you know, it could be. We see over high waters of Lake Erie in the fall. A lot of guys do a lot of fishing over there. I don't know if we have anybody that goes over there a whole lot here. But when the shad fill up over there in that you know, western basin, the central basin of Lake Erie, a lot of the shad makes it tough sometimes. But we also have an uncountable number of walleyes in the system right now, which makes it a little bit easier. So the problem of having too much bait is not going to be as big of a problem as you think it is. Might make fish a little bit more picky. You know, certain days you might have it, but it's not going to be, for the most part, you know, in a big picture, it's not going to be, that's going to be one of the last questions, one of the last worries we got. We're going to be more worried about, you know, if we can get on the, you know, the river and worry about the wind and the water clarity. Those are all first, you know, that's the last piece of the puzzle. If we're on a good spot marking good fish, we're worried about too much bait, you know, that's probably, you know, it's not the worst thing in the world.
In the morning, sometimes when you're out early,
yeah,
and it's maybe not sun all the way up, you're on the fish, you know, you're jigging, you're hitting good. When that sun comes up and everything kind of brightens up, the bite sometimes slows down. Whether you like to change your odds to you know, finish your day, get your limits, when that bite slows down when it gets, you know, different bite out. Is it just as simple as just changing your finesse mill to different colors, brighter colors, or what?
Okay, so I'll repeat the question. He asked if you guys have ever been on the river, like early in the morning, and you guys like just slaughter them, have a real good bite, and then the sun pops up and the bite slows way down, sometimes even shuts completely off. Usually that has to do with, as we mentioned, walleye or low light feeders, that usually has to do with light penetration. Usually it's really simple. It's really as easy as going to the nearest stained water. Where do these fish move over to? These fish are going to follow the low light to keep feeding. It could mean that they went to structure. So, you know, if it's just clean water and there's not any stained water for them to feel safe in, it could be as simple as rocks. It could be as simple as breaks. It could be as simple as relating to something. It could be as simple as a lot of things. Usually, when you're talking Detroit River and St. Clair River, usually it's going to be stained water. They're going to slide over into stained water, deeper water. You know, it's low. You know, deeper the water is, the lower the light penetration is. That's usually what it is.
When you go to shallow water, are you dropping the size of your jig? Like you're going 15 feet. Are you going down to like a 3/8, half ounce jig?
Okay, so he asked if I go into shallow water, if I drop my jig size down. That is exactly what I do. I fish half ounce, 3/8, usually in shallower water. But the lighter you can go, the better. I do fish 3/8. The reason is the heavier your jig is, the quicker that jig is going to fall. You know, there's days those fish like that quick fall, hit to the bottom. But as we mentioned, walleye aren't always glued to the bottom. You know, so sometimes having your bait off the bottom an extended period of time gives more fish a look at your bait as it's falling down. Sometimes that slower fall is more natural to those fish and they like it. If you're moving 1.5 miles an hour, you got a lighter jig, your jig's going to have a slower fall to it, you know, almost like a bead spoon when it comes to ice fishing out here. It's going to just have just a smaller, lighter fall that looks a little bit more natural, especially in light, shallower water. But also these fish in shallower water sometimes are a little bit spookier. They might not be inhaling the baits as much. They might be just nipping at them. So the lighter jig allows them to choke the bait a little bit better.
Yes, your fishing area, and say you're just hammering the white bass, right? You can't keep them off. You stay there, even if you see walleye.
He asked if I was in an area and I was catching a lot of white bass, if I'd stay there. If I'm walleye fishing, the last thing I want to do is I don't want to take white bass off the hook. So could you? Absolutely, because if the white bass are there, there's bait. Usually the white bass are coming in during that post-spawn time. So if the white bass are there, the walleye are somewhere nearby, but I always say go find them somewhere else because there's so many walleyes out here. You know, we go back to productivity on the water, time on the water. Do you want to spend your whole day taking white bass off on the hook? It's fun for some of us. Some of us want to go out and catch walleyes. You're going to find the walleyes somewhere. You'll find it. You can get away from the silver bass easier, I feel like, in these areas than you can get away from the walleyes sometimes.
Kind of I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead first. Yeah, he hasn't asked a question yet.
Going back to rod preference, I know you said a lot of it's what we like, preference. But are you thinking more medium power, fast action's kind of a go-to baseline to stick with?
Yeah, it depends, man. If I've seen some guys that really drive the hook home, they don't really leave much, doubt when they drive the hook home. It all depends on your, a lot of different things. But the best way I would say to do it would be if you don't have the rod, if you got a friend, you go fishing with, grab his rod. If you like the sensitivity, if you like everything about his rod, grab that one. If not, I would just say go to your local store, your tackle shop. I would suggest going to a tackle shop over a big box store, just because usually they're going to have people that are out on the water locally. They're going to be able to outfit you usually a little bit better, especially local settings like we are here. But it's all going to be what you like. The first one that you get in your hands is probably going to be the one you feel most comfortable with forever. So it's kind of a broad question if you don't have anything to compare it to. But
it's about the cadence some days, right? If your cadence is too fast, you might not even get anything, or if it's too slow, they might not hit that either.
Cadence is huge. He asked, if you guys didn't hear it, he asked sometime, or he shouldn't say he asked, he made the statement, cadence could be really big. Cadence could be huge. How many of you guys have been on the river and some male, it could be a guy, it could be a girl, he or she is just meleeing on them, and they seem to be the only one in the boat that is just sticking fish. Has anybody ever been in that position? And they're like, what are they doing that I'm not? Everyone's been in that position. Somebody's always hammering them, and you're like, what are they doing?
Same bait, same jig.
Yeah, same bait, same jig. You're over there, you're watching them. It's their side of the boat. Their side of the boat's better. Yeah, so watch the cadence. The cadence is huge. Everything could be big. Some days it might not matter. It seems like a lot of times out here, a lot of that stuff can be irrelevant. There's a lot of fish in the system right now. But the days when it's tough, the days where, it could be real quiet in the boat because there's not a lot of catching going on, that's when you want to focus on that stuff. Watch cadence. You could watch cadence of guys across from you. You see guys catching fish really good, you might see them doing something completely different than you. Could be huge some days.
What's the distance of travel that you lift up? How far do you lift?
So he asked the distance of how far off the bottom I jig. That varies. Early in the year, I like to keep it low and slow. I like to stay towards the bottom just because when the water's cold, a lot of those fish neutral to negative. They like to stay closer to the bottom. They're trying to get out of the current. They're trying to hide and tuck behind stuff. They got less energy. So I like to stay closer to the bottom. They're not going to want to chase as much. You're already moving at 1.5 miles an hour down current almost. So adding another aspect of them chasing in there when the water's 38, 39 degrees probably isn't on top of their priority list. So early in the year, I'm going to keep it real close, maybe a couple inches. Later in the year, it could vary. I mean, I tend to stay within maybe a foot of the bottom. You know, sometimes I go up a little bit higher, but usually I keep it, just like most people would. Usually, a good consistent, maybe 1 to 2 feet from the bottom when I'm jigging.
You tie your jig on, or do you take and use a clip?
I tie my jig on. The reason why I tie my jig on is because if I'm going to get snagged, I feel like the snap or something is probably going to bend out after a while. Also, it's a confidence thing for me. I don't like snaps. That's a me thing. I don't like them. When it comes to open water fishing, ice fishing is a little bit different. You get to panfish or walleyes on the small rods. It's a little bit different. But when it comes to open water fishing, I'm not a big fan of snaps when it comes to jigging.
Talk a little bit about the distance off the bottom, being right close to the bottom versus a little bit up there with regards to cadence. Can you talk a little bit about possibly the pause or the snap versus just a rhythmic cadence?
That's a really good question. She asked, in line with the cadence question, talk a little bit about maybe a pause at the top of your jig, or maybe a snap, something more aggressive. As we think about, once again, you're moving in the river 1.5 miles an hour. Your jig, you're not picking your jig up and it's not just sitting, stagnant in open water like it would be if you were ice fishing. You pick that jig up, a foot, 2 feet, 6 inches, 3 inches, whatever it is off the bottom, you hold it there, that bait's moving with the current until you set it back down. So in your head, you might think moving it's not really much action, but moving it, if a fish is following it and that thing comes off the bottom and is moving, as the fish is chasing, that bait's still moving downriver. That bait's still moving away from the fish. So sometimes that's big. When it comes to snapping it, that's something you see a lot of guys, especially later in the year, snapping it gets a lot better. But we think about why does it work better later in the year? These fish are really first of all, the water temperature spikes. These fish are on a really big feeding frenzy. They're chowing. So you get a lot more aggression pent up in these fish, kind of like how we are when we're hungry, right? You get a little bit more aggression. They see that snap when it gets warm out, metabolism's working. That can get them going.
What do you do differently from the spring to the fall?
As in, for jigging?
Yeah, where are you fishing differently?
Okay, so he asked the question, what am I doing differently when it comes to jigging in the spring as opposed to when I'm doing jigging in the fall? In the spring, I am looking for spawning habitat. In the fall, I am looking for fish that are going to be relating near bait, near where they're going to want to winter. So we think about some of these spots where these fish are going to winter. If you're a fish wintering in the river, like a lot of those fish we're catching all out there in the fall, a lot of those fish, you say Ambassador Bridge down, a lot of those fish are going to be in those areas all winter long. They're going to move into different areas. They're going to follow bait, as the water gets cold, as they hold in the river. Like I said, one of the first spots everyone goes to fish is the Belle Isle Bridge. The reason why there's a lot of fish from there down is you're near spawning habitat. We have spawning habitat on the American side, but you also have all those bridge pilings. Those all create eddies. That holds a lot of bait. You could pitch in those eddies and catch smallmouth, especially when the water bumps up a little bit, a lot, because those smallmouth are sitting there, catching all that bait that gets up in there. Sometimes you can even see the bait sitting directly behind the pilings in there if you go by really slow. But when you're looking in the fall, you're looking for those fish. They're going to be usually towards the channel, on the channel banks. They're going to be chasing bait, feeding, getting ready for the winter. All right, guys, I appreciate it. We could probably talk all day, but once again, appreciation for John for giving us time to talk. I'm sure he's going to come up and say a word.
I think everyone enjoyed that. Really good job.
Hey, if you like this video content and you want to get updated as soon as the next video is out there, hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon and you'll get notified as soon as the next video is up.